The last thing my father ever gave me wasn't the watch on his wrist or the truck in the driveway. It was a manila envelope, sealed with a strip of red wax like something out of another century, sitting in a safe deposit box for 14 months before anyone had a reason to open it. By the time we did, my stepmother had already told half of Cedar Falls she'd won. She hadn't. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years teaching high school shop class before I retired. And I've spent most of my life being the guy who doesn't make waves. That's not a virtue. That's just a habit I never broke. I stood by and watched a woman walk into my father's house 8 years ago and slowly take the reins of his entire life, and I told myself I was being a good son by not interfering. Folks, if you're new around here, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because I promise you, this next hour still doesn't sit right with me, even though I'm the one who lived through every minute of it. My father's name was Arlen Higgins. Everybody in Cedar Falls, Ohio, called him Big Arlen, even after he'd shrunk down some in his last years, because he'd run Higgins Feed and Supply on Route 9 since before I was born, and before that, his own father had run it out of the same brick building. 62 years that store had been open under one Higgins or another. My dad knew every farmer in 4 counties by name, knew their wives' names, knew which of their kids had gone off to college and which ones had come back home to work the land. When my mother passed of a heart attack, I was 24, and my father didn't take a single day off. He opened that store the next morning at 6 sharp, because he said the men who needed baling wire on a Wednesday didn't care that he was grieving, and neither did the cattle that needed feeding. He was the kind of man who'd slip an extra 20 into a farmhand's pay envelope if he heard the man's wife was expecting, and then swear up and down. It was a bookkeeping error, so the fella wouldn't feel like he owed him a thing. There was a young man named Miguel Torres who used to help unload trucks on weekends to save up for a car. One winter, Miguel mentioned, just in passing, that his mother's furnace had gone out. My father called a repairman himself, paid for the whole job, and told Miguel the company was running a winter promotion for loyal customers. There was no promotion. Miguel found out 2 years later from the repairman himself, and he cried right there in the aisle between the fencing wire and the fertilizer. That was who my father was. He gave things away and then lied about it so you'd never feel the weight of owing him. He married Deborah Kessler when I was 41. I'll be honest with you, I liked her fine in the beginning. She was warm, quick with a joke, had been a hospital administrator before she retired, always smelled like lavender hand cream, and she laughed at my dad's terrible jokes like she'd never heard them before, even the 10th time. She moved into his house on Willowbrook Lane, and within a couple of years, she was the one screening his phone calls, the one driving him to his cardiologist appointments, the one who told me not to trouble myself with the store's finances because she used to manage hospital budgets for a living and she had it handled. And here's my honest confession, the part I still lay awake with some nights. I let her handle it. I stopped asking to see the receipts. I stopped sitting in on the meetings with his accountant. I told myself I was respecting his marriage, respecting a grown man's right to run his own household. What I was actually doing was avoiding a conversation that made me uncomfortable, and I let that avoidance run for years, right under my own nose. Saturday, September the 9th, 5:52 in the morning. My phone rang so loud it about knocked me out of bed. It was Miguel, who still stopped by the store most weekends, even though he had his own family now. "Mr. Higgins, you need to get here. Your dad's on the ground. He's not talking right." I was in my truck in under 5 minutes, coffee forgotten on the counter, still wearing the shirt I'd slept in. By the time I turned onto Willowbrook Lane, the ambulance was already backing out of the driveway, lights spinning silent in the gray morning. Mercy General was 28 minutes away, with no traffic, and there was traffic. I called Deborah twice from the truck, straight to voicemail both times. I called a third time from the hospital parking lot, my hands shaking so bad I dropped the phone once on the asphalt. She finally picked up on the 5th ring, and I could hear what sounded like a hairdryer running in the background. "He's stable," she said, before I'd even gotten a full sentence out. "The hospital already called me." "Are you on your way?" There was a pause on the line. Not a long one, just long enough that I felt it in my chest before she even said the words. "I've got my hair appointment this morning, Walter. I really can't reschedule at this hour. I'll come by this afternoon sometime." Then, quieter, almost like she was talking to herself, "That's really more of a you problem right now, isn't it?" I stood there in that parking lot holding the phone away from my ear, not fully understanding what I'd just heard. My father had had a massive stroke. She'd been married to him for 8 years, and she was talking about a hair appointment, like the man who'd built her a whole second life wasn't lying in a bed with wires taped to his chest. Miguel was already there when I walked in, still smelling of diesel from working on somebody's tractor that morning. He sat with my father for the first 2 hours, talking to him low and steady about the store, about the new fencing order that had come in, like Dad could hear every word of it. Maybe he could. Miguel did that every single day for the next 5 weeks. Never once did he ask for a dime. Never once did he mention the hours he was losing from his own business. He just kept showing up with a thermos of the black coffee my father liked, made exactly the way Dad had taught him to make it 15 years earlier. Deborah came by 3 times in those 5 weeks. She stood near the door each time, glanced at her watch, and left before the nurses even did their evening rounds. My father died on a Sunday in October, 6:14 in the evening, with Miguel holding one of his hands and me holding the other. Deborah was at a luncheon. She said afterward she just couldn't bear to see him that way. I noticed things at the funeral that I didn't let myself look at straight on until much later. I noticed Deborah had already had new business cards printed up, Higgins Feed and Supply, with her own name printed underneath the word owner, and she pressed one into the funeral director's hand, like it was the most natural thing in the world to be carrying in your purse at your husband's burial. I told myself grief makes people do strange things. I folded that thought up small and put it away instead of looking at it head on. 3 weeks after we buried him, at the reading of the will, my father's attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Carol Whitfield who'd handled his affairs for going on 15 years, read out the standard breakdown. The house on Willowbrook Lane went to Deborah, plain and simple, since Dad had put it in both their names the year they married. But the store, the business itself, the accounts tied to it, the land the building sat on, all of that was still in my father's name alone, held separately, the way it had passed down from his own father to him. Carol read the line where he left every bit of it to me. Deborah didn't raise her voice. She never did. Not once in 8 years that I'd witnessed. She just looked at Carol and said, plain as reading off a grocery list, "I want the store, the land, the accounts, all of it, every piece." Carol told her flatly, that wasn't what the will said. Deborah said she'd take it to court if she had to. She said she'd given him 35 years of her life, and she wasn't walking away with just a house and his old truck. Now, I want you to sit with that number for a second, because it's going to matter later, and I promise you I'm not the one who's confused about the math. Deborah had been married to my father for 8 years. 8, not 35. I know because I stood up at that wedding myself and gave a toast, and I'd counted every one of those years since, mostly because I'd counted every year my own mother had been gone. So when Deborah sat in that lawyer's office and said 35 years like it was gospel, I felt something cold move through me, because either grief had scrambled her memory worse than I thought, or she was lying to Carol Whitfield's face without so much as a blink. I didn't say anything right then. I just filed it away, same as I'd filed away the business cards at the funeral. Carol pulled me into her office that same afternoon, after Deborah had stormed out threatening lawyers of her own. She'd handled my father's affairs a long time, and she looked at me like I'd taken leave of my senses when I told her what I wanted to do. "Walter, you understand you don't owe her anything. The will is airtight. We can fight this and win in about 20 minutes. Give her all of it," I said. Carol actually set her pen down and looked at me over the top of her glasses. "You understand what you're saying? The store, the land, 62 years of your family's work, gone, just like that?" Here's what I hadn't told Carol yet, because I hadn't fully let myself believe it was real. 9 days after we buried my father, I was going through his old roll-top desk in the back office of the store, and behind a stack of decades-old property tax receipts, I found an envelope, sealed with a strip of red wax, tucked into a hollowed-out space under the bottom drawer that I hadn't even known existed. There was a sticky note on the front in my father's shaky handwriting from those last couple of years. Carol, only if she comes for everything. I hadn't broken that seal. I brought it straight to Carol and asked her to hold it, sealed, until the day came that it needed to be opened. My father had known this was coming. He'd understood Deborah better than any of us wanted to admit, right up until the very end of his life, when his hands shook too bad to hold a coffee cup steady, but his mind was sharp enough to leave a trap behind him. Everybody who heard I was signing everything over to Deborah thought I'd lost my grip on reality. My wife, Sandra, sat me down at our kitchen table one evening and asked me plain, "Is this guilt talking, Walter? Because you feel bad you didn't check on him more?" My own son, 30 years old with a family of his own now, called me and asked why in the world I'd let that woman win after everything she'd done. I didn't have a clean answer for either one of them. All I could say was, Dad asked me to trust him on this, and I'm going to see it through. The final hearing got set for a Thursday in December, 9 in the morning, at the Marion County Courthouse, and I remember it was the kind of cold that gets right down into your knuckles. In the weeks leading up to it, Deborah's calls to Carol's office kept climbing. 14, then 22, then 31, then 40. Checking, pushing, making sure nothing had shifted, making sure I hadn't come to my senses. She had no earthly idea what was sitting in that envelope in Carol's safe. She would. I remember the morning of that hearing clear as a photograph pinned to a corkboard. Frost on every windshield in the courthouse lot. Sky the color of an old nickel. Deborah showed up in a charcoal suit I'd never once seen her wear. Hair done different than usual, like she'd dressed for a magazine cover instead of a courtroom. Her attorney, a slick younger man named Preston Marsh, kept glancing over at me with something close to pity, the way you'd look at a fella about to lose his shirt in a card game he didn't know he was playing. We all sat down at the long table. Carol slid the transfer documents across to my side first. My hand was steady, steadier than I expected it to be. I signed my name, Walter A. Higgins, right on the line, and I pushed those papers across the table to Deborah's side. She smiled. Not a big smile. A small, tight, satisfied little smile. The kind a person gives when something they've been circling for years finally lands square in their hands. She signed underneath her own name, without so much as glancing past the first page. That's when Carol Whitfield reached down and pulled out that sealed envelope. "Before we adjourn," Carol said, calm as still water, "there's a supplemental disclosure my client's father asked to be entered into the record, but only in the event of a formal claim to full ownership of Higgins Feed and Supply." Marsh's face didn't move at first. Then, Carol broke that wax seal and started reading. My father, it turned out, had done something I never once thought to do myself. In his last 2 years, even as his health was failing him, he'd gone quietly through the store's books late at night after Deborah had gone to bed. He'd pulled bank statements himself, cross-referenced them by hand against the store's inventory logs, and found a pattern stretching back nearly 5 years. Transfers moving out of the store's business account into a personal account that traced straight back to Deborah, dressed up on paper as payments to a landscaping and grounds maintenance company that, when the state finally looked into it, turned out not to exist at all. Small amounts to start, barely noticeable, then bigger and bigger as the months went on. In total, just over $180,000 moved out slow and steady, the kind of slow that's designed so nobody watching the surface numbers ever catches on. He never confronted her with it. He documented it instead, the same patient, careful way he'd run that store for 62 years. Bank records, a signed statement from the store's longtime accountant confirming that grounds maintenance company had never filed a single tax document in its life, and a letter, in my father's own hand, explaining exactly why he never said one word to her while he was still breathing. "I built this business with my own 2 hands, and my father's before me," he'd written, and Carol read every line of it out loud in that cold courtroom. "I won't spend whatever years I've got left fighting a woman I chose to love, but I will not let her believe, for one single day after I'm gone, that I never saw her clearly." The store's original ownership charter, drawn up by my grandfather back in 1961, and never once updated because nobody ever imagined it would need to be, had a clause buried in the fine print. Any owner or claimant found to have committed fraud against the business forfeits, automatically and permanently, any right to future ownership or proceeds, and becomes personally liable for repayment of the full amount, plus interest, from the date of discovery. Deborah had just signed herself into ownership of a business that, under its own 65-year-old governing document, she was now legally barred from ever owning, and personally on the hook for close to $230,000, principal and interest. The very moment that fraud disclosure hit the county record, Marsh went white as a bedsheet. I watched the color drain right out of that young man's face in real time, like watching water go down a drain. He leaned over and whispered something urgent to Deborah, and her tight little satisfied smile cracked straight down the middle. "This isn't," she started to say. "It's dated, it's notarized, and as of this morning, it's already filed with the county," Carol said, not raising her voice one bit. "You asked for everything, Mrs. Kessler Higgins. You just signed for every bit of it." She didn't shout. She didn't stand up and rage the way you might picture a woman does when she watches her whole fortune go up in smoke in front of a judge and a room full of strangers. She just sat there very still, staring down at that folder like she was running the numbers over and over in her head. And every single time they came out the same. I want to tell you I felt like celebrating. I didn't. Not really. Mostly I felt hollowed out and a little sick to my stomach, because I was sitting there watching my father's marriage get laid open on a table in front of people who'd never known either one of them a day in their lives. If any part of this story is landing with you the way it landed with me back then, go on and hit that like button for me. It truly does help more folks find these stories, and it means more than you know to hear from you down in those comments. The judge entered that disclosure into the official record right then and there. The forfeiture clause triggered automatically. No further hearing required, plain as the ink it was written in. Deborah lost any claim to that store the very same afternoon. She thought she'd finally won it, and the county opened a civil case to start recovering what she'd taken. She kept the house on Willowbrook Lane. That was hers by contract, fair and square, and I never once tried to touch it, never wanted to. The store reverted back to me by default, since I was named the alternate beneficiary the moment her claim collapsed under its own weight. I didn't gloat. I didn't call her up afterward to rub any of it in. She sent me one text message about 3 weeks later. "Your father could have just told me he knew." I never answered that message, because I don't believe there's a single answer in the English language that would have satisfied either one of us. He chose silence over what she'd claimed, in that lawyer's office, was 35 years of marriage. 8 years, and she'd stood there and called it 35 without so much as blinking, like she was hoping nobody in that room had ever learned to count. And some nights, I'll admit, I understand exactly why my father chose to stay quiet all those years instead of confronting her outright. And other nights, I wish more than anything he'd let me help him carry that weight while he was still alive to do it alongside me, instead of leaving me a sealed envelope and a hollowed-out drawer to work through all on my own. The store is still open, right there on Route 9. Same brick building my grandfather laid the counter in with his own hands. I run it now, 6 days a week, same as my father did, same as his father before him. Miguel comes by most every day now, not just weekends, and I made sure of that myself. Because a man who sits with your dying father for 5 weeks straight and never once asks for a dime deserves a place to stand for the rest of his working life. My son asked me once, sitting right there on my back porch, if I regretted saying give her everything that day in Carol's office. I told him no. I told him the only thing I regret is waiting, as long as I did, to look straight at what was sitting right in front of my own 2 eyes while my father was still alive, to face it with me, instead of him having to carry it alone in silence for the last years of his life. I don't know that there's a clean, tidy bow to tie on a story like this one. Deborah's case is still working its way through the county courts, as of this telling. My father's name is back up on that sign out front, the way it always should have stayed. Some wounds don't close up all the way neat, and I've made a kind of peace with that, rather than pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidy ending. If you've ever had to put your trust in somebody you love to see clearly what you yourself couldn't bring yourself to look at, or if you've ever kept the peace in your own family at a cost you didn't fully understand until it was far too late to fix it easy, I want to hear about it, friend. Go on and tell me down in those comments. And if this story meant something to you tonight, do me a favor and subscribe, because there's another one of these coming, and I have a feeling somebody out there watching right now needs to hear it just as much as I needed to live it.